collected fossils before? Cool, quite a few of you have. Who of you have collected rocks before? Quite a few of you have. Excellent. Who of you wants to know where you can find fossils here in Douglas County? Yeah, that should be quite a few of you. Cool. So what we're going to do is we are going to go through like a general overview of the geologic history of Douglas County, point out some things that you may not realize were influenced by geology, and where you can go to in Douglas County, not just in Lawrence, but across the county, and view some really cool stuff that's hidden in our landscape. So first, I'm Andy Connolly. I am an educator at the Kansas Geological Survey. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. I have a background in paleontology, which is the study of fossils. I have a degree in geology, both undergrad and master's at the University of Kansas. I also have a background in education. I was a park ranger for a while for the National Park Service, and now I'm a full-time educator. And I play the accordion. You might see me sometimes in the farmer's market, making both ends meet. Like, you can't make enough money for a musician or can't make enough money for an education, but if you do both, then you get it. You get by. And right here is me by the Kansas River, and this is actually the very same bone that's right over there. With a bison femur. So you'll get to figure out where you can find your own fossils here. I was really excited. This was one of the funnest moments of my looking for fossils time. Kansas Geological Survey. Out of curiosity, anyone here heard of that before? Okay, quite a few of you. Excellent. So here's the lowdown. Kansas Geological Survey is an institute of the state and also underneath the University of Kansas, where we study our natural resources. One of the big ones is aquifers. You have the Ogallala Aquifer way out in western Kansas. We have a lot of wells and a lot of research going into those aquifers. We have one of the most robust aquifer research programs in the nation. And we use that information to tell lawmakers, community leaders, farmers, ranchers about how much water there is, how much we're being used up, and what we can do to sustain it. Not just that, we also do other things like earthquakes, both natural and man-made, natural resources, and of course, rocks, fossils, everything else related to that. I want to give you a quick lowdown on who we are, but with that said, here's what we're going to expect from today's presentation. We're going to go over the general geologic history of Douglas County. We're going to show you places where you can view geology in action. We're going to show you spots where you can collect your own fossils, and we're going to give you some time at the end for questions, and also look up some of the material that I brought along here. And so here's the three main things that, if I were to have you to take away from today's presentation of things that influence Douglas County and the landscape you see here, is ancient oceans, the Kansas River and its tributaries, and ice ages. Any of these three natural phenomena has had its impact on the county in one way or another. And we're going to see that through the various history and the various ways that not only do we see in the landscape, but within our own community, our own architecture, building, and human history as well. And so this is a general geologic map of Kansas. When we look at a geologic map, all the colors here represent the exposed layers of rock and their time period. And so if you were to see everything in this dark purple color, this is rocks from the Pennsylvanian age. This is a time period that was well before age of dinosaurs. So if we see rocks from this time period exposed on the surface, this green layer, this is Cretaceous period. This is during the age of dinosaurs. And so I wanted to give you a broad overview because I'm going to hone in on the Douglas County side, which means most of the rocks, when you're driving, either on the county roads, I-70, wherever, when you're driving along and you see the road cuts, you see the limestone, you see the shale inside of you, that's going to be a Pennsylvanian age era of rocks. If I were to put it in numbers, that's going to be about 300 million years ago, and I'll give you a little bit more context besides that. Also, I get really excited. I might like go forward, but please feel free to ask me any questions, any clarifications, things like that. I'm more than happy to answer. So when we zoom in, we have here Douglas County. Most of the layers of rocks that we see here are going to be Pennsylvanian age. This white sediment, this white layer, this is sediment that's deposited by rivers This is as recent as you can recently get in geologic age, because this is geology that's happening right now. When we think of geology in Kansas, we're thinking stagnant, still, nothing is happening, but that is far from the truth, because the rivers themselves are doing geology in action. They are eroding and depositing layers of rock and sediment. And all this white is that deposition from the major rivers of Lawrence. And as for this orange stuff, these were rocks and sediment deposited by glaciers thousands of years ago, which is really cool. So if we were to break this down, we can see two major influences in the geologic age in Kansas. We have the Pennsylvanian era, about 300 million years ago. That's when we got an ancient ocean over Douglas County, a lot of invertebrate fossils, some of which you may have heard before, like crinoids or brachiopods. And we have the relatively recent, 2 million years and younger. This is when we have the glaciers that would come all the way down. This is when we have ice age mammals. This is when we also have the Kansas River flowing eastward. Rocky Mountains are coming up, the rivers are flowing away from the continental divide, and the ice age mammals are going to those rivers to drink from them. So these are going to be the main two time periods that we're going to see influence here in Douglas County. So let's first start with the Pennsylvanian period. This is kind of a wonky map, but basically think of North America, and then you rotate it 90 degrees, and then you swing it down south towards the equator. And that's where we were. Kansas was right on the equator during this time. And so this was, during this time, North America is coming in to Africa. There's things like Arkansas, Louisiana, the southeast of the US, not really existing. In fact, they're beginning to form as they collide into Africa. That landmass is being risen, and that's creating the Appalachian Mountains, which still stand today. And so basically, Kansas was beachfront property, which is pretty awesome. And so I tell people, because Kansas was right on the equator, because it was a shallow sea, that meant you had the seafloor close to the surface, close to the sun, which is creating a bountiful community, coral reef, very similar to that of the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. And so these seas drop layers upon layers of rock. This is very typical of what we see throughout eastern Kansas, this layer between blocky limestone and more fragile shale. And the reason why it alternates is because of ice ages. Not only do we have ice ages of the recent, but also ice ages of the past. When the world got cooler, that means more water was locked into the polar caps, which means more water sank. But then when the world warmer, the ice caps melt and the waters deepen. And so this change from shallow to deep meant that the sediments that were being deposited also changed as well. And so whenever you see these layers of rocks, it means that you can witness those seas getting deeper and shallower over time. And one of the best exposed regions of these sedimentary rocks is actually on the Lawrence Bike Loop. Now, I'm a native Lawrencean. I actually grew up, right about here. And I was basically on what was then basically the western edge of Lawrence. And I would bike all over the place. And I would bike all the way down to it wasn't even a bike loop then, it was just a path that connected Clinton Lake all the way to the movie theater. And you see this beautiful exposed layers of rock there. And I tell people that's was one of my genesis to become a geologist, a paleontologist, because Kansas may not have the bombastic igneous rocks or the very cool looking metamorphic rocks, but damn, we have fantastic fossils. Our fossils are amazing across the whole state, not just eastern Kansas. The whole state, you can find a bevy of fossils rich with life that tell you what the world was like millions of years ago. And so let's see if I can actually get this to play here. If not, that's okay. Okay. Well, it's supposed to be a YouTube link of a drone. And this drone is a footage of going over the spillway of Clinton Lake. And so it's on our YouTube channel. But basically, it's a great way to get exposed to those beautiful layers of rocks. Because everywhere else in Douglas County, you're maybe getting at best like a meter or so exposed layers. But this is one of the best ways to get a good bird eye view of the change that's happening across Douglas County over time. And this is also a really nice place to look for invertebrate fossils. Before we get to the fossils, though, I want to talk a little bit about the limestone itself, because limestone, I think, is an overlooked, almost literal foundation of cultural history in Kansas. Because some of our most iconic buildings, some of our most historic, important buildings across Kansas is made from the limestone quarried from the very state itself. That includes the Topeka Capitol, that includes many of the courthouses across the state, and then of course that also includes the KU campus buildings. There's a layer of rock called the Oread limestone, and that is what caps Mount Oread, which is what it is named after. And so the Natural History Museum was built and quarried from these layer of rocks, that and Spooner Hill as well. So I think whenever I think of iconic skylines, a lot of times I think of the Lawrence skyline, because when you're coming in from I-70, you're seeing Fraser Hall, you're seeing the Natural History Museum, you are seeing that geology that was once underground is now exposed for everyone to see, which I think is quite poetic. Now, the cool thing is, within those rocks themselves is that rich coral reef community that I talked about. This is pretty similar to what I would say you would see in the seas 300 million years ago. We got snails, clams, brachiopods, sponges, crinoids, all sorts of diverse animals that made up this rich ecosystem. Now I'm going to go through the most common ones. There's a lot to go through and a lot of names of them. But I want to stress at the end of today's presentation, I got examples of them right here. And I still have some invertebrate fossils of Kansas pamphlets. So if you want to pick one yourself up, this is good to give you a nice little lowdown of the area. So all the fossils I'm about to tell you are the ones that you're most likely to see within the rocks themselves. The first one are called bryozoans. They can form, have a net-like shape. They can be twig-shaped. They can even be dome-shaped. But they are one of the main denizens that made up the coral reef community of these ancient seas of Kansas. So about bryozoans. These are my favorite, crinoids. I love crinoids. Think of them like a sea anemone. So they're latched on the bottom of the ocean, and they wave their tentacles around. And as they wave their tentacles around, they're picking up all sorts of food within the water column. But the problem is that the tentacles are weak and soft. They dissolve away, and the column is nice and hard. So the column falls apart and fossilized, leaving the discs or the columns that you very frequently see within the rock itself. We got brachiopods. These are basically our main shelled animals, not quite related to clams, are actually their own branch of animals. And I almost forgot. I forgot about one of the most important things about crinoids. Their closest relatives are actually sea stars. And what's interesting about it is that some of the cross sections of the crinoid discs have a pentagram shape to them, which is reminiscent of their sea star relatives, which is very cool. Brachiopods are very common. They come in all sorts of different forms and shapes. We also have horn corals. The very beautiful example here. A lot of horn corals nestled and bundled together. We have snails, marine snails in this case. And we have the rice fossils, fusselinids. These are basically simple single-celled organisms that have this nice tough shell around them, and it creates an almost rice shape to them. It's very rare to find them in a loose form like this. You're more often likely going to see them like in this form. And this is the most interesting one. This is something that my colleague at the Natural History team told me about, and the one I only found out about a week ago or so. You can sometimes find nodules that inside them have fish brain cases. And they may not seem like much on the surface, but when you open them up, you see there's like an interesting structure on the inside. This is what's left of their brain case, which is really cool. Sometimes you get that, sometimes you get parts of their shoulder bones as well. That's created in these little nodules. So if you find a nodule like this within the rocks, if you're gentle, you can try to crack it open and find those fish brain cases on the inside. This is practically the only vertebrate fossil we get from this time period. Very cool. I never heard about that until now, and I'm always learning something new in terms of geology. You're never done learning, that's for sure. And so here's the thing about fossils, is that when the animal dies and the shell goes to the bottom of the ocean, the shell gets buried. What happens is that the shell slowly dissolves away, leaving an empty mold of it. And then that mold gets filled in with water rich with minerals, and it recrystallizes into calcite. So all the fossils that you see, none of them have the original material on them. But this is important because this recrystallization, basically, it locks the minerals in place. And the fossils are buried in a weaker matrix, in a weaker surrounding rock. So what does that mean? Why am I saying this? It means is that as it rains, the rain is slightly acidic and will very gradually, over time, dissolve and wash away the sediment of the rock. The calcite of the fossil zone is much harder, and it stays behind. And so after a while, the fossils begin to pop out of the matrix, that's the surrounding sediment, within the limestone itself. And the cool thing is, and I can never stop thinking how awesome this is that you can be a paleontologist, someone who studies fossils, just by walking outside the store and going across the street or down the road. Because the fossils are within our own community. For instance, the Douglas County Courthouse, although the limestone is not from this county, it's from a little bit west of here. Within the fossil, the limestone, we can see those fusselinids. This is an actual photo. I went right up to it, just took a photo of it, and you can see the fusselinids right here. The interesting thing is, because Kansas has been around long enough that our famous limestone buildings have subjected themselves to the rain and the weather. And so over time, you get to see the fossils begin to really pop out of the stonework. Any old structure across eastern Kansas is going to have these fossils within the matrix. This is the inside of Limestone Pizza, and obligatory, this is not an official endorsement by the Kansas Geological Survey of Limestone Pizza. But within Limestone Pizza and other restaurants and shops downtown, when I'm on board, I like to just look within the rocks themselves, and you can just see them while you're waiting for your dinner. So it's like it's the when you expose yourself, when you're like, it's one of those things like if you drive a car, like a new model, you begin to see that model all over the place. You're like now in tune to it. Geology is very similar. There's a famous book, which now, of course, I'm forgetting the title of, where a person walked through the same neighborhood in New York City and had an expert walk alongside her and each expert was on a different a field of study, whether it's history, animals, plants, whatever. And you could do the exact same thing for downtown Lawrence. You could have a geologist walk down with you through downtown Lawrence and tell you what kind of stone there is, what fossils you have in there. You could do it for an architect, you could do it for birds, plants, whatever. I think like that is just really cool to me. So we have that, and really once you like realize that like any limestone structure you see across Douglas County is bound to have those fossils within them, which is really cool to me. Any questions so far? Yes.
How do you know that Kansas was down on the equator back then?
Yes.
Andy, could you repeat the question for the people?
So the question was, how do we know that Kansas was on the equator back then? So that is a great question. The first one is that so when you're driving, so bear with me with my analogy for one moment. So when you're driving from, say, Lawrence to Baldwin, you go through a road cut, and within the road cut, you can see the layers of rocks, and they're continuous. They stretch for both sides. You can apply that on a much larger scale. The layers of rocks that we see here in Kansas can be matched up to those that we see across the world. That's the first piece of the evidence. The other one is a little bit more complicated, but it's called paleomagnetism. When you have a rock like igneous rock, when it cools and hardens, there's little magnetic filings within it. And what happens is they get locked in place, pointing to where North Pole is relative to their position. And then they begin to move and shift over time. They're still in that position. And what you can do is then you can take that that position where it's pointing and say, okay, based on where these filings are pointing, they're probably at this latitude. And so taking that into account, both the ancient compass pieces and how we can connect our layers of rocks across not just the US, but also across the world, helps us reconstruct the position of Kansas. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Thank you for asking. Yes?
Maybe better for the end of the presentation, but is there a common app you can download to your phone that identifies rocks, what type they are?
Oh, you know, there is one. I can't remember. I tried it out once. It was okay. I am a big fan of iNaturalist myself. I think it's great. Let me double check on that because I know there are apps that do that, but they're not quite, I don't think they're there yet compared to the plants and animals that we take around. But I'm willing to bet that one day they will be.
You can try Google Image.
Yes, that Google Image can also work really well too. I agree. I want to make sure that I don't go too, okay. So not only do we have oceans, we also have rainforests, because like I said before, the oceans are getting deeper and shallower over time. What that means is not only, there were sometimes Lawrence was not just on the ocean, it was also shoreline as well. And this was an equator, which means we had warm, wet, tropical plants. So, like this one right here. This was a fantastic time in Kansas because this is when forests really took off. And when I say we, the Kansas Geological Survey got really lucky one year because there was this big construction project on the intersection of 19th and Iowa. And part of the reason why they're doing it, they did that was to build a tunnel that goes underneath it. And I frequently use it to bike up to work. Well, when they dug underneath it, they hit the plant fossil payload. There were so many plant fossils within there that we and the Natural History Museum just went and just got as much as we could. Because here's the thing. When a kid asks me, like, what is the rarest fossil? What is the most unique or the coolest fossil? I tell them plant fossils. Plant fossils are incredibly rare because plants themselves, for the most part, are very weak, especially the leaf impressions. Petrified wood, that's just like bones. But leaf impressions, that's another story altogether. So seeing these rich ancient tropical rainforest plant fossils within those rocks was astounding to us. And I believe my colleagues at the Natural History Museum are working on a paper to publish these findings on there. And that's the way it is for a lot of fossils. They are found through construction projects. That road cut that connects Lawrence to Baldwin, I remember that was a relatively recent changeover, and there was a lot of hullabaloo about it. Well, when that road cut was happening, geologists just like went to it like buzzards to a dead animal, because that was freshly exposed layers of rock. You can't get that anywhere else. And so that's enough. Like, I myself haven't personally found the plant fossils out in the wild, but they're really cool. And I highly recommend you go to the Natural History Museum, go to the basement, because they have a really nice exhibit on ancient plants underneath their own little glow light that show what kind of plants used to be here at one time. One of the more common fossils you'll find, it kind of looks like a scales of a lizard. This is actually bark to a tree that is, it's called Lepidodendron, but more colloquially known as scale trees. And I got some fossil samples right up here. Okay, we're going to switch gears now. So we went from the ancient ocean. Now we're going to go to the relatively recent. We're jumping way past the age of dinosaurs. We're going into the age of mammals. We're going right around 2 million years to the recent. So, during this time, a very interesting event happened, and that was Antarctica. So, another big theme or takeaway I'd encourage you all to have from this is that plate tectonics affects everything geology related. We don't really think it affects Kansas, but it does. And this is one of them. Because as Antarctica is separating away from Australia, away from South America, it's creating the circumpolar current, and that gradually cools and cools over time, creating glaciers, creating permanent ice caps. This is one of the reasons why we had ice ages 2 million years ago, and technically we're still in an ice age. We're in what we call an interglacial period, where we're in a warming period. I won't get into human-caused climate change because that's going to be another thing altogether. But this is one of the reasons why we had glaciers here in Kansas. So this is a map that shows like the close up in the Midwest. We have Kansas right here. We have Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota. And so about 2 million years ago, an ice sheet crept all the way down. And this is about as far south as the ice sheets went during this time. Which is really cool to me. In fact, this whole northeastern section of Kansas is called the glaciated region of Kansas, because you can see evidence of glaciers during this time. So how do we know that? Well, one of the biggest, and this is the part that I just think is really cool, is erratics. There's these big pink boulders that they're called erratics because they just seem to show up out of nowhere. Because when you think of the typical rocks of Kansas, what comes to your mind? It's shale, limestone, sandstone. These are very soft sedimentary rocks. These are rocks deposited by oceans and rivers. But this is not that. Quartzite is what we call a metamorphic rock. This is, I would call, the daughter of sandstone. Sandstone that got buried, and over time, it got squeezed together. The crystals in the sediment recrystallized to form this big rock that's just, like, that's a boulder. And you can find these pink boulders all across northeastern Kansas. And so these erratics are far from home. The erratics have their own genetic blueprint that we can actually trace up to the bedrock way up north to South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. And so glaciers act as big boulders. How do glaciers form? Glaciers form when snow and ice accumulate over time. And the snow doesn't melt, and eventually under its own weight, it moves forward. And one thing that I actually like to demonstrate with my kids about glaciers is that slime actually works very similarly to glaciers. Although it's a much smaller scale, slime moves pretty similar to glaciers in a very if you were to pour slime out, it kind of moves in almost a tongue-like manner, and it moves under its own weight. As slime gets piled up, it gradually pushes out like that. Think of glaciers as a very huge, very slow-moving slime. So as the glaciers move, they churn up the landscape and just really dig into it. And as they dig into it, they're picking up all sorts of material along the way. A lot of the softer rocks get pulverized and just demolished. But the quartzite is very resilient. It's polished into these nice round boulders. I can't help but talk about this one. This is not Douglas County, but this is just one of my favorite examples of a glacial erratic. This is a small town called McLeod. And when they built this road, there was this huge glacial erratic that was just so big that instead of trying to move it, they just built the road around it, which, if you're not careful at nighttime, I imagine this thing is just like on the other side of cars. Erratics are one of those geologic phenomena that once I knew about it, I couldn't stop. I saw it everywhere. Literally, you just find it. Just every time I see it, I was like, "There's one," and it's just really funny. You can see it. People will use the erratic stones for garden boundaries. This is one in Baker University. They use them to make a little archway. And because they're so strong compared to the weak limestone, a lot of people use them as signs. This is from Blackjack Battlefield. And they just oh, here's a nice quartzite. And they just put the sign right on it. That's not going anywhere. It's not going to break down. And so a lot of people in northeastern Kansas have really used these for really beautiful decorations, gardens, anything like that. You can go walk around anywhere in eastern Douglas, in eastern Lawrence, and you're going to find these just all over the place here. If you drive around in the county roads, farmers will have these huge quartzite that almost act as like little guardians at their gateway, at their entry points, which is very cool. And of course, you may have recognized this, the prayer rock. Prayer rock is also a glacial erratic. And part of its significance is because, like I said, these rocks seem to show up out of nowhere, nothing else quite like them. There's quite a bit of significance to that. Also built on a quartzite cobalt pedestal. But the real kicker of these erratics is that erratics aren't just one type of rock, they can be multiple types of rocks. And that includes Lake Superior agate. So I got some agate specimens up here that you can take a look at afterwards. But on the outside, they may not look like much. Some kids told me that it looks like a round ham. I see it. But when you slice them open, you get these beautiful banded appearances on the inside like that. This one's a more of a faded example, but some that are more rich in iron can get these beautiful examples like that. You can find these erratics along rivers, creeks, stream beds, but they're pretty rare. And also, since they're much sought after, you might have a harder time than usual trying to find a quartzite. I find so many quartzites, yet to find an agate one. You may find one day yourself, but these are the really cool stuff to look after for. And it's something that us northeastern Kansans are privileged to. We're going to switch gears just a little bit because during this ice age, not only did they bring erratics, but they also brought ice age megafauna. And so this was an article from 2005 where these guys just kayaked down the Wakarusa River and found a mastodon skull just coming out of the riverbed there. They didn't dig it. They didn't use special tools or anything. They just said, that looks like a skull over there, and just walked over and there, sure enough, there it is. And that's the cool thing, is that the major rivers that flowed during the Ice Age still flow today. However, rivers are alive. Not only do they carry sediment, but they also move and change and go all over the place. And so what happens is that an animal may go up the river, maybe it dies or it gets buried in a flood. The river buries it, the river moves away, the animal is fossilized, the river comes back, it exposes it, and now you can find an animal from that time period. And I have found quite a few fossils on the Kansas River sandbars, like this one. This is a bison vertebrate. Just by walking around and keeping my eye open. So I found this one kind of like this, sticking out of the sandbar. And I just brush away the rest of the sand and it comes out just like that. So I tell folks, great time to go right after a good rainstorm. Rain comes in, it's going to wash away some of that sand, pop up some new fossils from there. A lot of times you're going to find bits and pieces. Teeth, pretty common. Teeth are pretty common, like this bison tooth, for instance. Makes sense. Teeth have naturally evolved to be hard, take a pounding throughout our whole lives. Bones, not as much. They're more likely to break and fragment, but the teeth are hard. They're more likely to survive fossilization and be exposed. So what I'm going to do a quick little crash course on some major animals that roamed here during this time. So bison, really common. Were around then as they are today. They're going to be the most likely fossil that you would find. We have both mammoths and mastodons. These are both elephant relatives, and they both eat different kinds of food. So mammoths are more traditionally eating grasses, very hard, silica-rich plants, while the mastodons are going to eat more shrubbery, tree-based foods. This is Arctodus. This is from a very large bear. So you can get some cool bear fossils here. Of course, we also have tusks from the mammoths as well. These are all from the Natural History Museum, by the way, which is very nice of them to lend out to me. And again, you're more than welcome to come up here. Sometimes when you go into the river, like I said, a lot of times you'll find scraps and pieces. They may seem like nothing, but this one's really cool. This one is part of a backbone to a giant ground sloth. I really like giant ground sloths. There is an interesting hypothesis I've heard about ground sloths that I think a lot of you could appreciate here. So I think I mentioned earlier, I'm a native Lawrencian. In my backyard growing up, we had a hedge apple tree. Weirdest fruit out there. Not even squirrels want to eat them. But apparently, giant ground sloths may have been one of the main sources of, they might have eaten them, and based on scat remains. And so what's interesting is that a lot of major fruits that we see in the world rely on herbivores to eat them and carry their seeds elsewhere. But many animals do not like hedge apples. But sloths may have been one of the main carriers of hedge apples. And even though they're gone, the hedge apple tree is still around as almost like a relic of the past. It's really interesting. And I saved my favorite to last. I'm going to do some audience participation on this one. First, take a quick look. Anyone have an idea what this could be? What do you think?
Saber-tooth tiger skull?
Saber-toothed cat skull, not quite.
Beaver.
It's a beaver. Nicely done. A giant beaver. I love the Pleistocene, the animals where this time period came from. This was the supersized era. We got supersized bears. We got supersized vultures. We got supersized mammoths and sharks and all sorts of critters like camels and horses and llamas and beavers. This is Castroides. This was about the size of a black bear. It's missing its two large incisors, but if you were to come up here afterwards, you can see in its nasal passage the root of the incisors, because unlike our teeth, which are one and done, which sorry, I don't like, but beavers continuously grow their incisors over time. And so you can see that root of that new incisor coming out like that. Very cool.
Got a question over here.
Sure.
Hey, how do you
get bones identified, and also like when I find them, they're very fragile. Like,
Yes.
They just fall apart if you're just holding them.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you identify bones and how do you handle them? Yes, they can be very fragile. So the Natural History Museum have experts that can try to identify things for you like that. I consider myself relatively knowledgeable when it comes to fossils. You can always send me an email about that. Most of the time, like I said, probably going to be bison. As for the fragile part, that is a great question. I used to have my bison femur out in like a circulation in like the grade school classroom. It began to form some cracks though, and so I'm like, okay, it's time to retire this one. A lot of times, the best thing to do is to like, and just try to be careful, have little boxes with the little the felt there, and also doing a nice spraying, like a sealant over it, that can help make sure things are more likely to stick together.
Because I have some like tibias or something, there's long bones.
Yeah.
One of them just like disintegrated while I was carrying it.
Yeah, and that can happen. That's like the fossils themselves are in the river. They're going to be dissolving and breaking down over time if we're not there. But good question. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up today's presentation just to make sure we have time for questions and y'all coming up here and look at this. I want to stress that we do school visits. This is available for all grade levels. If you know any teachers on hand, that I think would be really cool. If you want me to come to your classroom, we can do all sorts of things. I commissioned an engineer to make what I call a shake table, which is basically you just put a building model on it and just shakes back and forth to simulate earthquakes. I think it's really cool. I'm looking forward to it. And we don't just visit Douglas County, we visit all of Kansas schools. And I want to say thank you for the Watkins Museum of History for hosting me here. It was really nice of you. Thank you to the Natural History Museum of KU for lending me their vertebrate fossils. And thank you to my colleagues, Olivia, Joan, and Hannah Sidlowski for lending me their agates. Like I said, they're pretty rare, so it was really nice of them to lend me their agates. So that's it for the presentation. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask?
Really, can you go back to the last slide so I can get your information? Thank you.
Yeah. All right, the gentleman
How far
right
out
there.
from here does the Ori, so we know the Oriad limestone caps
Yeah.
are around here. How far out from here? Like, could you walk to Kansas City and there would still be Oriad limestone at that? Or
Oh, that is a good question. Because you can see Oriad limestone across, because some of the other hills across this area have some of that Oriad limestone on there. I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet that if you go west of here, that you'll still see some, because as you go further east from here, you're getting into younger and younger layers. The rocks are being broken down. So you won't find any in Kansas City. You're more likely to go westward into the Topeka area, maybe into the road cuts and see them there.
You can see them there in the road cuts. If you take the highway, even the farm side, if you take that into whatever, you can see it in the road cuts there. You can see the different layers. Don't look too hard because then you're going to have a wreck.
Yes, and I think that's also a really good question. Something I forgot to mention, like a more of a call to action or like where you can go from here. Although you can see road cuts and good rocks there, I encourage everyone not to go to there to look for fossils on them. You might get a talking to by the sheriff, or you might get into an accident. Instead, what I recommend is going along our creeks and streams. They're going to be eroding into the limestone, and that's going to be more freshly exposed layers of rock. Those are going to be good places to look for the fossils. And as well as going along the Kansas riverbank, whether it's in Lecompton or here in Lawrence, you can go down to the sandbar and look for some of those Ice Age mammal fossils yourself. What's up?
Some plant fossils that are really great that used to be in the quarry in Ottawa, just south of the 59 highway.
Yeah.
Junction, there's a quarry over there that you could just pull them out and there would be like burned leaves on them.
Yes, so the person said that you can find plant fossils just south of Ottawa. I haven't heard of this one. I'm gonna have to look into that. I'm always finding new places to look for them. Yeah, excellent, thank you. Anyone? Yes?
How big is your organization? And I assume every state has one, and is there a federal higher level one that you all work with?
Yeah, so the question's about how big the Kansas Geological Survey is and if every state has one. We are special, so we have about 160 members or so. We are, I'm biased when I say this, but we are one of the better geological state surveys in the nation because of how well funded we are. The state government recognizes our value in the community, people of studying our aquifers, we're also looking at water quality, like looking at how safe is the water to drink, where are the contaminants coming in from. So we have a pretty robust program that's not only here in Lawrence, but we also have a separate office in Wichita. Other state surveys, not as much. I think the one in Iowa, I want to say, it's like half a building that they're sharing with other folks, and they have the outreach, what is that? They don't have that. And I am in a privileged position to be in a position where I can really connect with folks about this. As far as the federal level, there's also the United States Geological Survey, and they do a lot of research in terms of more broad, impactful areas. Like a good example off the top of my head is they have a Yellowstone station where they continuously monitor earthquakes and eruptions and everything like that in the Yellowstone area. It's very cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How thick were the glaciers that reached here, and how do you estimate their thickness?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I mean, we're constantly, when I say we, I refer to geologists in general, constantly shifting and updating our ideas, because the map that I showed you there is based on our most recent evidence. Now, the figures that I read show that people estimate that when the ice sheets were coming down, when they reached, say, New York City, they're thousands upon thousands of feet thick. But we're on the edge, the precipice. So by the time we get here, it's basically maybe a dozen feet thick. And what's interesting is that when the glaciers melt, it causes this huge outwash of sediment that just erupts from the glaciers. And so a lot of places in northeastern Kansas, you're just going to have these absolutely massive deposits of sediment that came in here by the glaciers. Donovan County in northeastern Kansas have these big rolling hills. They're just made from these thick deposits of sediment pulverized by the glaciers. What's up?
Was the chambered nautilus here?
The chambered nautilus, you can.
There.
Yeah, so, yes, I see, yeah. So this is more common in western Kansas, and I actually got some other cool rocks and minerals across the state up here as well. The chambered nautilus is more common in western Kansas. You can sometimes find it here, but not as likely. Way in the back.
Was there volcanoes in Kansas, or did we just have sediment that came in from other areas?
Okay, so the short answer to that is no. The longer answer to that is we have volcanic ash in western Kansas that came in from the Yellowstone eruptions. And I say eruptions plural, and what's really cool is you can date that ash to the several different eruptions that happened in Yellowstone. And people actually used to mine these frequently in western Kansas for it.
When was that?
The eruptions? Oh man, you're kind of testing me to see. It's
Roughly, I think it's day of the week.
Yeah, it's 1.6 million years, 2.5 billion years, and 7.5. It's something like that. 3 separate eruption events. And obligatory geologists saying Yellowstone's not going to erupt anytime soon. We're pretty good. But we got that. And then the other thing I would also can't help but highlight, because it's vaguely adjacent to it, is that southeastern Kansas used to be a big mining facility, the tri-state mining district of Missouri, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And so an influx of rich minerals created from an upseep of magma below ground created these large, beautiful minerals like galena, which we used to harvest frequently for the lead, along with the sphalerite, which we use for the zinc. So we don't necessarily have volcanoes per se, but we still had some of their influences peeking into our state. Yes.
It seems like the glaciers came down about to the Kansas River. Is there a correlation? Did it start, stop, cause rivers?
Yeah, I'm not fully in line with the literature about it, but yes, there have been instances where the glaciers have actually caused the Kansas River to reroute entirely. Where it used to flow, I don't know why I'm pointing to the screen, there's no map up there, but it used to flow much more northward, and the glaciers basically dammed it and forced it to flow more southward. I want to have time to make sure people can come up here and to look at the stuff. But how about this? How about your question?
When did the last glaciers withdraw from the area?
The area is about 2 million years ago, but there were ones from about 200,000 years ago that reached down to Illinois. Those were more recent, but they did not come down to Kansas. Yes.
Is Mount Blue a glacial moraine?
I don't know what Mount Blue is.
It's the big mound south of Highway 10, Blue Mound.
Oh, Blue Mount. I don't know. I haven't seen it myself frequently. I presume it's not. Usually the more hilly areas are going to be more on the northeastern side. Yes, did you?
I have a question. With practice that's going on in this, well, parts of Kansas and down in Oklahoma, and doing geology, have you seen an increase in small earthquakes in this area?
Okay, this will be our last question because I want to make sure we have time for everyone to take a look at the stuff up here if we want to. So the question is, do we see any evidence of fracking tying into an increase of earthquakes in Kansas? The answer to that is no, but not in the way you think. Because in this case, fracking is the injection of salt water to push the oil out. What we have is different, is after when I say we, like people in general, companies retrieve the oil, they go through a process to clean it up, and they have this really dirty, really briny, salty water that they don't want to just dump into our rivers. So instead, they take all this brine water and inject it deep, 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 deep below ground, far below any aquifer. And what happens is that water acts as a lubricant. So any kind of rocks that are like in pressure with each other, they get that lubrication and they slip. And so what you're seeing, there's a really great map that demonstrates the before and after, is that when we look at the earthquakes of Kansas, they're all kind of, not a lot, not very strong. But then after this increase of saltwater injection happened in the two southern counties, bam, explosion of earthquakes, one of the largest recorded earthquake in modern memory. KGS, along with other institutes of Kansas, came in and said, whoa, you got to cool it on this. Sure enough, after they reduced that process, the amount of earthquakes decreased like that. Very good cause and effect that we ourselves, like I said, we study to ensure the safety of not only people through aquifers, but also through earthquakes. Again, thank you very much for your time.